Hey, Crossridge, we are continuing our look at the Psalms together. Last week, we got as far as Psalm 10, and in that Psalm, there was one verse in particular we kind of stopped at, and I said we'd come back and say something further about it today. Psalm 10, verse 15 says, "Break the arm of the wicked and evildoer, call his wickedness to account till you find none." And we said sometimes a statement like that can be troubling. Are we supposed to pray it or not? Psalm 11 has something similar. Verse 6 of Psalm 11 says, "Let him rain coals on the wicked, fire and sulfur, and a scorching wind shall be the portion and their cup." So we have these statements at times in the Psalms. They're known as, some of the Psalms are known as imprecatory Psalms, or at least they have imprecatory statements in them. An imprecatory Psalm or statement is simply a statement of curse upon an enemy or opponent, and you find it frequently in the Psalms. So Psalm 69 verses 24 and 28 say, "Pour out your wrath on them, let your fierce anger overtake them. May they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous." And so the question that arises in our minds is it appropriate for us as Christians to pray these types of psalms or these types of statements? And I said last week that the short answer is yes. I want to expand on that a little bit today. I really want to say just 5 things about imprecatory psalms and statements and how we ought to deal with them. The first thing is that we need to recognize what these psalms are and what they are not. In simple terms, these are simply pleas that God's justice would be done. It would be executed. They're not vindictive words. They're not a plea that God would just wipe out everyone the psalmist doesn't like. They're a plea that God's honor, it would be upheld. Secondly, I think we need to remember just the rules governing the interpretation of poetry. The language in the Psalms is intentionally emotive. It is meant to arouse our emotions, and David or the other psalmists are often dealing with very emotional situations, and you will know that in poetry, hyperbole is often used to make a point. Thirdly, need to remember that these are prayers. They're prayers uttered to God. These are not just statements that I'm going to act in this way or I'm going to take vengeance on all my enemies. What the psalmist does is what we ought to do is that we ought to take those concerns and we ought to lay them at the feet of God in prayer. And then fourthly, a good reminder is to remember that the New Testament sometimes speaks with less severity, but sometimes with even more severity. And Jesus used statements of imprecation. He said things like, the one who causes a little child to stumble, it would be better for him to have a millstone tied around his neck and for him to be tossed into the sea and drown at the bottom of the sea. Or you might remember the Apostle Paul. When he had an opponent, he had different things to say about his opponents. So he would say things like, "Look, if anyone is preaching a gospel other than the one I preach to you, let him be accursed." And in specific, with one opponent in particular, he said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, "Alexander the metalworker has done me much harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done." So there is a sense in which it's entirely appropriate for us to pray this way. But then finally, I would say that these prayers ought to be prayed differently. There is a sense in which they're prayed differently for us as Christians. We are desiring that God's justice would be done and would be executed on the earth. But our prayer is not that our enemies would ultimately be destroyed, but that ultimately they would be saved. And I think Romans chapter 12 gives us some good counsel in terms of how we ought to think about this. I'll just read verses 19 and following. It says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And that's the approach we ought to take in regards to all people, is that our ultimate desire is for their salvation.